I'll announce this a couple of times. We are recording this session, so you might like to turn your videos off as you will be part of the recording if your camera is open. And we'll also have everyone muted during the session today. If you have a need, please feel free to chat to us and we will respond. Thank you. Okay, in the interest of time and to thank all of you who joined us on time, we're going to go ahead and get started. As I said, this is the second of our series, Be More Human. In September, we spoke about power and politics and racial injustice. And today, we're going to be talking about wealth and the legacy of racial injustice and how we come to this place in our country now, economically, and the impact slavery had on our current economic status. So this series is based on the 1619 Project, which is an initiative of the New York Times Magazine that started back in August of 2019, being the 400th anniversary of slave trade in Jamestown, Virginia. So keeping in step with this historic event, we are doing our series in two parts on the 16th of the month and the 19th of the month. The 16th is dedicated to sharing information based on one of the articles in the series with some knowledgeable speakers to help all of us gain more awareness of some of the issues that we live with every day and may not be so aware of how our present state came to be. I think we take a lot for granted about our economy, our social structure, our social system and where it fails, and not really have a good understanding of how we got to where we are. So we will be, we enjoin you to read these articles on the website where we're advertising the series. We have links to the podcasts as well as to the articles, and they are quite informative. What I'm going to do to kick us off is just to talk a bit about some of the facts that were in this particular article on wealth and racial injustice. And I'm not a historian, so I'm just going to share a bit about what I read so that we have some context for the discussion with our speakers today. So we're all familiar with the 40 acres of the mule promise from the US government to freed slaves. I've added here a borrowed mule because apparently they were only loaned from the Army. They weren't part of the deal. And this actually came about as a field order by General Sherman. And we also most know from history that this didn't really happen, the 40 acres and the borrowed mule, because when President Lincoln was shot and Andrew Johnson became president, he rescinded this field order that was put forward by General Sherman. And specifically, let's see if I can see my quote here, because I have Zoom features in my way. "This is a country for white men, and by God, as long as I am president, it shall be a government for white men." And that was his declaration upon rescinding that field order. So I think our first speaker, Dr. Goodman, will cover this in a lot better detail than I am stating it now, but this was one of the factors in the article that, we talk about the economy, we talk about unemployment, we talk about sustainable wage, living wage, minimum income, but wealth is really a better way of speaking about how well people are doing. And Dr. Goodman is going to really tell us more about the difference between wealth and the money we have to spend today. But I think this is an interesting fact that, and I don't have the source or the date of this, it is in the article, that the median family wealth for white people in our country is 171,000. And that probably typically includes things like stocks and housing and other sort of non-cash wealth, compared to 17,600 for Black people. It's a huge difference in the ability to acquire low rate credit and just negotiate in a world where we live with cash and plastic. So, and one of the statements here is that the major way people accumulate wealth is through inheritance and family legacy. And there'll be a couple more effects in a minute that indicate how that is a difficult process for most Black people to accumulate wealth from generation to generation. So embedded in our history and even in some of our laws, and you'll hear again more about this to help us understand it better, there is, or was, and perhaps is, but was for sure, a prevailing thought that Black people should not be successful, that they should not have property, they should not have money, they should not be successful. And it really led to a lot of social events, violence even, that prevented Black people in this country from accumulating wealth, so, or being successful. And many are successful. We know now that we have plenty of corporate 500 CEOs, bank presidents, business owners, but we also know that that has been more the latter part of the 20th century and still not equitable. So financial progress by Blacks was considered or regarded as an affront to white supremacy. So if folks were to do well, Black people should not in any sense do as well as white people in business, in society, and we know from history, and we'll talk about a couple of events that happened, that violence was used against Black people to ensure that this concept, this idea, this social structure stayed in place. So there were Black codes and Jim Crow laws that were actually legislated primarily at the local and state level, that were agreements that Black people should not have access to certain capital, certain property, certain jobs. And these laws have largely fallen by the wayside, but some of our prevailing social beliefs still are institutionalized in a way that these ideas persist. So the civil rights movement and federal laws over time have been enacted that help to move away from Black codes and Jim Crow laws, but they weren't always very successful either in protecting Black people or promoting their progress. In the 30s, the New Deal was to help the middle class regain its footing after the market crash in 29, but much of that still did not pertain to the Black population because, as we read here, Black population prior to World War II was primarily agricultural labor, agricultural labor, and the New Deal did not apply to their labor. We know that schools were segregated in 1954 under Brown versus the Board of Education, which even now in 2020 is under fire. But tried to end segregation in public schools. And we continue the battle with education. Even the GI Bill, even though it was to help the soldiers returning from World War II, was still disproportionately applied to Black veterans in discriminatory ways. So we mentioned that there was lots of violence that was exacted to help maintain the gradient between white and Black population. In general, 1919 was called the Red Summer. There were many various incidents around the country that led to the deaths of 240 Black people. We've been hearing a lot more about the Tulsa Race Massacre in Oklahoma. There have lately been a number of theatrical presentations that are sort of shedding light on this. Apparently it was sort of set aside in the media very quickly, as was the Rosewood Massacre in Florida in 1923, but both of these communities were well-to-do, self-sufficient, self-sustaining Black communities that were vandalized and people murdered and businesses burned down in the face of Black economic success to minimize that. This was following World War II and government and the market crash of 29 to help the middle class regain footing by assisting with housing. But, and we'll hear more about this later, I think, a lot of this did not help Black residents in Black neighborhoods because they were excluded as being hazardous for the economic investment. And the GI Bill I mentioned earlier, even though it was for all veterans, there was discrimination within the banking industry that prevented many Black GIs from taking part in the impact of that bill. So I invite you to listen to the podcast, to read the article, but we're going to move forward, and our next speaker is going to be Dr. Rae Jean Goodman. Dr. Goodman is a member of First Presbyterian in Annapolis, and she's an economist who taught many years at the Naval Academy, and she is going to be sharing some information with us about the Black and white wealth gap. Dr. Goodman.
Thank you very much. Much of what I'm going to talk about, Annette has touched on in her presentation. My information comes basically from fairly recent research by economic groups, the Urban Institute, the Brookings Institute, and the National Bureau of Economic Research. We're going to look at sort of 5 things: the wealth distribution overall, how it has changed over time, as well as differences amongst Blacks, whites, and Hispanics. We're going to look at some of the historical causes and efforts to remediate the wealth gap, and what factors contribute to wealth disparities, and how you can build wealth, the various sources of wealth building, and then possible policies to reduce the disparities. Okay, so this shows you the distribution of family wealth for everybody at 3 different points in time, in 63, 83, and 2016. And basically what it's showing is that the wealth distribution is very skewed. The bottom 10% of the population virtually has no wealth at all. But the the top 90 and 95% of the population, or 99% of the population, their wealth has increased. Families near the 90th percentile, their wealth has increased 5 times between 1963 and 2016. Basically, the wealth inequality has increased significantly over that period. Okay, here's the average family wealth by race and ethnicity. You can see that in 1963, the average white family wealth was 121,000 higher than the average non-white wealth. By 2016, white wealth was 7 times greater than Black wealth and 5 times greater than Hispanic wealth. Now, causes and efforts to remediate, obviously 246 years of slavery meant that they were unable to accumulate any sort of wealth because they were not paid for their labor, and so there was none of that. 40 acres and a mule, Annette referred to General Sherman's Special Order number 15. That actually resulted in 400,000 acres being given to Blacks. In other words, taken away from white slave owners and given to Blacks. In 1867, there were the Reconstruction Acts, which specified the process for admitting the Southern states back into the Union. And under Reconstruction, the land that the 400,000 acres that Blacks had gotten in the South were returned to their original landowners. And the Northern Army withdrew from the South, allowing all these sort of discriminatory practices and violence to go on. And an interesting thing, which gets looped back in later, is on Indian reservations, the federal government required the slaves held by Indians, when they became free, the Indians had to give them 40 acres and a mule, not a rented mule from the army, but a mule. And recent, I think it was a 2016 publication, research looked at these African Americans on Indian reservations who got the 40 acres and a mule, and looked at them both in 1900 and 1920. Because the census at that time, you could actually follow individuals and look at what their wealth and income were. And those people had wealth and had, you know, steady income and that sort of thing. So the slaves on Indian reservations ended up better off. One could argue that the federal government tried to punish the Indians even more by requiring to do this. But the next effort at helping freed African Americans was the Freedmen's Savings Bank, which was created in 1865. And it was to give freed slaves a place to bank, as well as how to learn about basically financial instruments and dealing with the financial system, since as slaves, they obviously had very little personal experience with that. But in the financial panic of 1873, with other mismanagement by the government of the Freedmen's Savings Bank, the bank was shut down on June 29th, 1874, and depositors lost $3 million. Please remember that at this time, we didn't have the FDIC. That was a later phenomenon, part of the New Deal. So these people, they lost everything when the bank closed down. Annette mentioned the Tulsa Greenwood District. Now, that was founded on Indian territory in 1906 By 1921, it had a population of 10,000 people. And on May 31st, 1921, whites attacked this district, killed hundreds of people, 1,000 homes were completely destroyed, lots of businesses, and that area never recovered from this violence. However, there were other developments on Indian land that did thrive, not anywhere near as the Greenwood District, which became known as the Black Wall Street. But that was a short-lived 15-year event. Jim Crow Black Code started in 1865, 1866. They were set up to restrict voting rights, to restrict what jobs Black people could have. They restricted the ability for a Black person to quit their job, in essence, creating another form of slavery. And they also restricted the types of property that Blacks could own. Now, these were state and local constraints. They weren't the same in every state or every locality. States passed the restrictions that seemed to fit with their view of how the culture should be structured. The GI Bill, as mentioned by Annette, was supposed to help people be able to get mortgages, to be able to buy homes, that sort of thing. Banks would not lend to African Americans for mortgages. In addition, you had a lot of deed covenants and informal racism that prevented them from being able to buy real estate. And the GI Bill also had educational benefits. African Americans were able to take advantage of those education, and they did take advantage of that, and that helped to lift some of them out of poverty. The Fair Labor Standards Act was to protect labor, was to provide a consistent wage. However, it had an exemption for domestic servants and agricultural workers. These were occupations dominated by women and minority men. African Americans were also excluded from the CCC and the WPA projects. So even those parts of government programs to help the economy get out of the Great Depression continued to discriminate against African Americans. Also in 1932, there was an Economy Act, which said that women were excluded from holding a federal government job if their spouse held a federal government job. You know, once again, constraining African Americans' ability to receive income and develop wealth. And redlining, and you're going to hear more about redlining in the next presentation. Okay, so what contributes to the growing wealth disparity? We need sort of to understand two different things. Income is the money coming into the family, earnings, dividends, any sort of cash government benefits. Wealth are the family's assets, their savings, the real estate that they own, their businesses, minus any debts. So it's a net wealth concept. So family income distribution from 1963 to 2016. The three lines represent, the top line is the 90th percentile, how family income increased over that time period. The middle line is for the 50th percentile, so half the people were higher, half the people were lower. And the bottom line is the 10th percentile. And both the 10th and the 50th basically show no great increases in income over that period of time. Whereas for the 90th percentile income distribution, the income increased nearly 90%. Now here we're looking at the average accumulated real lifetime earnings for people who are ages 58 to 62. They were people born between 1950 and 1954. Basically, people with lower incomes have a very hard time saving. So the average white man earns $2.7 million over a lifetime, while the average Black man earns 1.8, and the average Hispanic man earns $2 million. All of the real lifetime earnings for women are much lower than for men, which continues to today. Some of this disparities reflect the fact that any sort of historical disadvantages carry forward into future generations. Here we have the average family wealth for people born 1943 to 51 by race in terms of whites and Blacks. Whites accumulated more wealth over a lifetime than Blacks do. In their 30s, whites have an average of 147,000 more in wealth than do Blacks, and in their 60s have 7 times what Blacks have, or $1.1 million. Okay, how do you build wealth? How have any group of people build wealth? And in the United States, predominantly home ownership, retirement savings, student loan debt, wealth building tax subsidies, and inheritances. And we're going to look at some of these individually. Home ownership from 1976 to 2016, what you have there is that in 1976, 68% of white families owned their own home, compared with 44% of Blacks and 43% of Hispanics. By the time you get out to 2016, the gap has narrowed slightly for Hispanics, but it's widened for Blacks. Oops, let's go back. Liquid retirement savings. Liquid is referring to the ability to change it into cash. So in other words, your house is not liquid. Your savings account is very liquid because you can turn that into cash fairly quickly. So this is talking about the average liquid retirement savings. It starts in 1989 because during the 80s is when IRAs started and 401ks and all those ability for people to save for their own retirement. And you see that white families in 1989 had 25,000 more than Black families, and by 2016, white families had 130,000 more than Black families did. Why is this true? Well, generally in terms of jobs that African Americans have had, they have less access to retirement savings vehicles, programs. They tend to participate at a lower rate when they do have access, and lower income, Black, white, Hispanic, etc., contribute a smaller proportion of their income to retirement, which makes sense because you don't have enough income. You're spending most of your income on housing, food, all of the necessities, and you don't have a lot of excess for savings. And in general, if they have saved, any sort of emergency that comes along wipes out a lot of what they have saved. Student loans are another burden because, you know, a debt gets subtracted off of your wealth to produce these net wealth values. And so what this is the average family student debt loan for ages 25 to 55 in the 1989 to 2016 period. Basically, Blacks have carried a higher student debt loan than whites all through this period. In 2016, 42% of Black families had student loan debt, compared with only 34% for similar white families. Black families have, the reason for the higher student loan debt is they have lower wealth, they have fewer private resources. Exacerbating this is that Black students have a lower graduation rate, and degree in hand promotes greater economic mobility and greater income and wealth in the long run. So those factors lead to higher student loan debt. Inheritances. A recent study by Hamilton and Darity concluded, in looking at all these different elements, inheritances and intergenerational transfers account for more of the racial wealth gap than any other demographic or socioeconomic indicator. So not having the ability to save and have wealth and be able to pass those on, either as an inheritance or while you're still alive, you provide gifts to your children. Not having that ability contributes significantly to the racial wealth gap. This is showing you the asset building tax subsidies, you know, saving credit, IRAs, employment retirement funds, and then state and local property tax deduction. Basically, these are tax subsidies that benefit the higher incomes much more so than low income, as you can see, because this is referring to the high, low are percentages in the income distribution. What policies can we talk about to try to reduce the wealth inequality and racial wealth gaps? We can limit the mortgage interest tax deduction so that the wealthy don't get to take advantage of it as much, and we could use the revenue to provide a credit for first-time home buyers. We could establish automatic savings as part of retirement plans. We could reduce the reliance on student loans while supporting success in post-secondary education. In the current political discussion, that's, you know, community college free for all, probably given income tests. Most of the politicians have that, but this would certainly help reduce the student loan debt on African Americans. Offer universal children's savings account. This is sometimes referred to as baby bonds, which is for every child that's born, the government opens up a savings account for that child and puts $1,000 in it. The family can contribute to that savings account over future years, with probably some limits like $2,000 a year. This would then give the child, at least upon graduation from high school or at some stated point in the future, some savings to either support more education, support starting a business. It opens up a lot of opportunities that currently do not exist. Reform the safety net program asset tests. These asset tests are things like, sure, well, you know, you now rent and you get a rental subsidy, but if you decide to own your own home, we take away that subsidy. Okay, so some of the asset tests are actually counterproductive for building wealth amongst low income. We need to somehow promote emergency savings. There have been some proposals that link it to rebates that occur at tax time. These are all policies that have been discussed and for the most part have been analyzed by economists. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rae Jean. That helps us begin to translate our knowledge into some action and understanding of where we are today. Rae Jean mentioned redlining. We are going to move forward now with discussion by McKenna Lewellen on redlining and housing in Baltimore. McKenna is the assistant director at the center here in Baltimore. The center is dedicated to giving folks from around the country experiences in community living, assistance, and development. And McKenna, please go.
Great. Can everybody hear me? I think I unmuted myself. Great. We've been sitting for a while and listening to some really good information. So before I rocket off into my favorite topic to talk about, I want everybody to take a deep breath in and let it out. And bring your shoulders up to your ears and breathe in. And let it out and shake your arms. And then start to wonder where your feet are. Are they on the couch? Have they lifted up onto their sides? Or are they flat on the ground? And take a deep breath in and let your feet rest. And let it out. All right. This really truly is one of my favorite things to talk about. When a group comes to the center, whether it's a local group or a group from out of town, we kick things off by telling them about the history of Baltimore City. And it is a jolt to the system because it is something that their history classes, no matter where the group has come from in the United States, is teaching them. No matter what economic background, no matter what race, no matter what, they have not heard this unless they're taking an AP US history class and they've got a really, really great teacher. This is new information for most of them. And then it's even wilder to watch them encounter these ideas as something that's not just happening in Baltimore, but that's something that's happening in their own backyard. We talk about it in a Baltimore specific context because that's where we are, but also because some of these policies that I'm going to talk about are like homegrown Baltimore white supremacy. And so with that in mind, we're going to hit the big four Baltimore housing segregation policies. I'm going to share my screen. All right. So most people, when they think about racist segregation housing policies, want to start in with Hulk maps. And that's a really good place to start. But in Baltimore, we have to go back probably 20 years before that. So in 1910, it passed and came into effect in 1911. There was a segregation ordinance in the city that was passed by the city council. It happened because of a specific set of events. Most of the United States in the early 1900s was already segregated. But a Black Yale-educated lawyer moved into a neighborhood near Bolton Hill. It was like right off where Bolton Hill is now. And that was an all-white community. And there was vandalism of the house that was constant. And finally, it came to the city council pretty quickly. He moved there the summer of 1910, I think. And by Christmas, they had passed an ordinance, the first of its kind in the United States, that said that people of different ethnicities, nationalities, races, and religions had to live segregated from each other. So you had neighborhoods sort of solidify into homogenous zones. So you had neighborhoods like Reservoir Hill, which is now pretty economically and racially diverse, was the neighborhood where Jewish families lived. Bolton Hill was where wealthy merchants who owned things and ran businesses out of the port moved so they could get away from the smell of the port. There were whole blocks that were for different groups of European immigrants that had moved in together. So if you go down to the neighborhood around Highland Park now, you'll see still a big old Orthodox cathedral, even though there are not Ukrainian immigrants living around the cathedral anymore. And so these neighborhoods really really solidified in the early 1900s because of Baltimore. So the background on this slide is actually the front page of the Sunday Times news magazine that was published on Christmas Day, 1911. The gentleman in the middle is the mayor. He's quoted in the article. Oh, I forgot to drop all these things into the chat for you. I'm going to do that right now so you can play along at home. So he's quoted in this article as saying, Black folks should be quarantined in isolated slums in order to reduce the incidence of civil disturbance, to prevent the spread of communicable disease into the nearby white neighborhoods, and to protect property values among the white majority. So it is, obviously, it's a segregation ordinance. It's explicitly racist and in favor of white supremacy. But you can also hear echoes of a public health argument, which is deeply racist, and then again, specifically about maintaining property value for white communities. So that's 1911. We're going to jump forward into the Hulk mapping. If you haven't looked at a Hulk map before, I commend a little homework to you. I've dropped the link into the chat that it has this sort of database. University of Richmond has put together all of these maps and has them online. So in response to the market crash and all of the economic anxiety of the Great Depression, as Dr. Goodman told us, there was the New Deal response. There are different estimates on how much or how little money ended up going to Black families and Black individuals from that New Deal money, but the amount that went to Black families through the Hulk mapping and loan process is like almost nothing. It's, I mean, like 2% maybe. And so in 250 cities across the United States, bankers, real estate agents, and lawyers were paid to draw maps of their local communities. And this is Baltimore's. They designated specific boundaries for these neighborhoods. And you can see that they sort of wind around each other, just like Baltimore living does, right? Like you cross a street and you're in a different neighborhood. A lot of that is because of these maps or because of the segregation ordinance. So if you look at these, you can see that there are on the right side of your screen, the percentages of how much land was designated each of these by grade. So these Hulk task forces designated them in 4 colors. So green is the easiest to get a home loan in. These neighborhoods you can see here, this is Guilford right here. We're going to zoom in on a minute. Guilford and like Northwood over here. They're neighborhoods where wealthy white Protestant people live. And it was specifically Protestant people. There were some Catholic families there maybe, but mostly it was white Protestant business people. So it was very, very easy to get a home loan in those neighborhoods. The next grade area was blue in outline. So Baltimore was mostly blue. If you look at cities in the South, like Montgomery, Birmingham, Jackson, I think Montgomery was the highest percentage of Black neighborhoods that were redlined that I saw. And they redlined like 65, 70% of their city, which is just bonkers. But so our majority is blue. So it's still easy, it's still possible to get a home loan in a blue neighborhood. It's a good neighborhood. There may be one or two things that set it off of being a green neighborhood. That could be proximity to a yellow or redlined neighborhood, or new development, or any number of things. So Roland Park at this point, because it was a newish development where it was harder to sell properties than it was in Guilford, is outlined in blue. Yellow neighborhoods were often neighborhoods where white working class people lived or where immigrant families lived. So people who were not yet called white, but were foreign-born immigrants or foreign-born white people lived in yellow outlined neighborhoods. And red neighborhoods were outlined, are the territory where Black folks were living and where some immigrants were living. So you can see a lot of the red outlines in Baltimore are around the port. So there are a ton of immigrants living, particularly where Highlandtown and Canton are now, living really close to the port so they can just walk to work. So we're going to zoom in on a couple neighborhoods. And I, again, commend this resource to you as something to play around with because it's important to look at really in detail. So if you click on any one of these outlined areas, they'll pop up on the side with all of this information that they gathered. And so it has it typed out for you, but I also included a photo of the original document. So this is Guilford. It's a very nicely planned residential area of medium to large homes. Direct transportation to the center of the city is good, close to business area on Greenmount Avenue. There's a section 5 on this form that's really important to name out loud as we're talking about racist housing policies. The Hulk program was not just about whether or not a neighborhood was risky to give a loan to, it was about who lived in the neighborhood. And that section 5 is really indicative of that. So there's a whole line item to talk about if there's an infiltration of a type of person or community into the neighborhood. And Guilford, it says there's no infiltration of anyone undesirable for the document. No foreign-borns, no Black people, and there are businessmen and executives living here. And then it gives the annual family income. So if we jump down a few miles into East Baltimore, so this track actually goes all the way down into like where you can see the little square that's white where Hopkins Medical is, if that helps you give, helps the map in your head. So again, if we look at this, this document, accompanying document, most of the people who live there are laborers. There's a mix of Italian immigrants. And so this is actually also where the, oh, I'm forgetting what the name of it is. There's an Italian, it's like a, something for Italian orphans or something, like right down in, where down by the water now that Presbyterians have been involved in. Anyway, and it's a neighborhood, it's a community where lots of immigrants and Black people live. And so it's been heavily redlined. And so it would have been impossible to get a home loan here. And it already says here that the property is in a bad state of repair. So they're saying the wrong kind of people live here and the property is not worth investing in. And so if we think now about the kinds of structures that exist in that area, most of the new builds and most of the structures that feel stable are structures that Hopkins has been taking over and rebuilding and gentrifying. And so it's taken a really long time for any kind of investment to come into this community, like since before redlining was a policy. So eventually those policies were overturned by the courts, and white people in the United States needed another way to figure out another way to keep their neighborhoods all white. So this is another like wild adventure in white supremacy that was born and bred in Baltimore. Neighborhood covenants started popping up. So this was actually a pet project of the Roland Park Company. The same developer that built Roland Park also built Guilford and Homeland, probably not totally surprising. But they wanted to make sure that these luxury garden communities would only be occupied by the right kind of people in their eyes. And so, and actually you can see in this quote that I pulled, you can see in these early documents a desire to exercise that decaying filth, in quotes, of urban life. So they used really creative, and I say that with a little bit of salt, really creative land use documents to keep things from being built in that community that weren't just homes. Then you can see there's a provision in 1912 that follows the 1911 document or the 1911 city ordinance that said that no one who is Black can own any land or build anything in this neighborhood or live in the neighborhood, and the prohibition is rescinded so that Black domestic servants could live in the neighborhood. So these were sort of put out after the housing ordinance or the segregation ordinance to test the water, and then they really strengthened over the years, and were sort of the main way of keeping Black people from owning property in these communities. And they were really, actually, one more thing, they're really difficult to take out of the homeowner association bylaws because it requires 100% of the neighborhood to vote in favor of removing it. So Rogers Forge, a neighborhood just north of Northern Parkway in Baltimore County, just last year, or this year, very recently, finally voted to take it out of their bylaws. They weren't acting on it, but it was still there. And a lot of the original deeds of the homes in these neighborhoods have lines in them about prohibiting the owner from selling to a Black family. Which brings me to the last of the big four. Blockbusting was not invented in Baltimore, but we really took to it. So it was a practice that was very popular in the 60s and 70s. Real estate agents would purposefully create fear and anxiety in white neighbors by selling a house in a white neighborhood to a Black family, and then circulating a pamphlet or circulating that information somehow to the white families to tell them that their neighborhood was going to decline quickly because the Black families were moving in, and that they had to sell now if they wanted to get out. And so the homeowners would panic and sell those houses not to another person, but directly to the real estate agent, who would then turn it around and sell it back to a Black family at double the price, or rent it to the Black family at a higher cost. And so often Black families moving into these stable neighborhoods would be sort of roped into really unfair contracts where they were in sort of like a weird rent to own situation where they would have been paying money every month to go toward this house, but they didn't own it until 17 years in, and so they didn't have a chance to build equity even though they'd been paying for it. So the picture on the side of the screen is out of a local news investigative report from a few years ago, and it's about Edmondson Village, actually where Hunting Ridge is. And in 1960, it was 99% white, and 10 years later, it was 97% Black. So blockbusting moved people really quickly in and out of neighborhoods. And all of these policies have direct impact on how the city is today. We tell everyone who comes through our program that nothing is the way it is on accident. Everything from a stop sign to a one-way street to whether or not there's garbage pickup to whether or not there's a sidewalk is an intentional decision that people made. The city is not this way on accident. And so this is a map, if you think back to sort of where the redlined areas were in that original map, this is a map of where vacant houses are now in Baltimore. If I showed you a map of where Black residents lived in Baltimore, it would be the same map. If I showed you a map of food deserts in Baltimore, it would be the same map. And this is a homicide map from last year. So again, same map over and over and over again. We're telling the same story over and over again with different language, and it's not all traceable back to segregated housing policies, but it has a lot to do with it. So I'll kick it back to Annette.
Thank you, Rae Jean. I'm sorry, McKenna, thank you. So, I guess as we're listening, and I'm thinking some may be asking, why is this important? Why do we need to know this? And I think what McKenna just said is really pivotal. Nothing that we're experiencing right now is by accident. It is the consequence of deliberate actions in the past and deliberate actions now. We all have an opportunity to weigh in on what's going on in our country, and sharing this kind of information is what will help us do that. And we're going to open for a few questions that you may have that you'd like to ask of the presenters. But first, I'm going to share with you an interview that Kenneth Walker had with one of his church members at Knox. Kenny, are you there? Do you want to speak a little bit about the interview? Okay, he might be trying to unmute. I think I'll go ahead and go to the next slide and let us hear, and then maybe Kenny can follow. Okay, I think I need to make sure I share so that you can hear. Share computer sound. Let's try that again.
In Alabama, and wherever else when Martin Luther King came along. And you mean to tell me you did not know or ever heard or read in a book in school about the 400-year history that blacks went through? They moved out. Because it wasn't a block that we moved in later that had not been all white. Yeah, what separated us is the streetcar tracks where there was the white side and the black side. And went to school in the South Carolina because some of the missionaries in the Presbyterian denomination went to the South and opened up schools so the black children could know how to read and write. Yes, most everybody. Most all the black men worked at Sparrows Point or the shipyard because that's why they migrated from the South to get a job at Sparrows Point. Okay. Now, they didn't pay them a whole lot of money. They didn't come because of the money, but there was some money.
Okay. This was an hour-long interview, believe it or not. And it is my technical ineptitude that limits us to hearing these few clips. But Ms. Sims did a great job of talking about neighborhood change, experience with employment, and in terms of what McKenna was talking about, the blockbusting and redlining. But with that, I hope that what we've shared is enough to pique your interest in learning more. I really commend those articles to you from the 1619 Project, and in particular the podcasts. I did not add it to my slides in the very beginning, but there's a good discussion in the podcast about the contribution of cotton to the American economy and how important that was. The hundreds of years of slavery and cotton growing fueled the economy of the early United States. There's one quote in there that says that the economic impact of cotton in the United States was larger than all of the industry and railroading and all of the other factors that contribute to the economy. That statement we've heard that cotton is king is real. And cotton was a brutal fact of life in American slavery. It is what created the need to have so many slaves, because it was a very labor intense kind of activity, and it was very brutally applied. So we have an economic system right now, a capitalistic system that had very dubious beginnings in terms of how that was managed. Black people were actually mortgaged and part of the financing of that industry. So So please read that article, listen to the podcast. And I want to thank our presenters, McKenna and Rae Jean, very much. Thank you all for being here. And I'd like to go ahead and open mics, Frank, if we can, to let folks have some comments or questions of the speakers.
Anybody want to raise their hand? Who'd like?
Yes, most everybody.
Everybody.
Sorry, I'm gonna, okay. Go ahead, Frank, sorry.
I was just saying, if anyone would like to ask a question, please raise your hand so we can unmute you. No, no questions? Oh, kind of. Whoops. I accidentally muted you. Go on.
That's it. Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, great. The presentations were excellent. A lot of information that was presented touched home because I live right, if you know where Greenmount Avenue and York Road is, on the other side of York Road is Guilford. One side, the west side is Guilford, and the east side is called Wilson Park. That's where I grew up at. And you literally saw a difference once you walked across York Road. I went to Guilford Elementary School, which was in the Guilford area, and yes, it was a big difference. Oh, and also one more thing. Yes, Ms. Sims, that was an hour-long interview, but she really raised the point where her family came up from the South, and most of the people who did come up from the South that were looking for employment end up at Sparrows Point. And that area where she lives in near Sparrows Point, is still a Black community.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.
Cynthia, you want to speak?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Excellent presentation. I just two thoughts that came to my mind. In terms of destroying Black communities or sections of communities that were built up to house banks and small businesses and the like, one of the things that I think destroyed a lot of those areas nationwide was the interstate highway system, because there was a lack of political power in those communities, and people were looking for pathways to put these structures, and many of them just went right through Black centers of economic power that never recovered from that. And that was in the 50s and 60s. And, people were saying it united the nation, and in some sense it did, but it also left a lot of destruction in its wake that related to Black wealth. And the other thought that came to mind was, all this is cumulative and still continuing, because I think about the differential mortgage and interest rates that Blacks are and people of color are generally charged. And the lack of banks even in communities where you have to rely on currency exchanges that, just charge enormous interest rates and things like that. It's just still going on. So that was just my thought.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that, as we're taking groups of people around the city, we ask them to tell us when they notice that we've gone into a different neighborhood than we were just in. And a lot of us use language like, this is a good neighborhood, or this is a nice neighborhood, or this is a bad neighborhood. And we're talking in code, like we mean a lot of things, but sometimes we don't actually know what we're talking about, or we do and we don't want to say it out loud. And so we make them say it out loud for 2 hours while we're driving them around. And one of the first things that we have to sort of push them to see, a group to see, is that there are no banks. Like people, that they're not even looking for it, because a lot of people who live in white neighborhoods are so used to there just being a place to go bank that they don't even think to look for the absence of one. Where like a lot of our students of color who come through are like, yeah, I see a currency exchange thing right there. I know what kind of neighborhood we're in. So, and then to your highway point, actually one of the, like, there are 1,001 clear examples of this, right? And it's all over Baltimore. Like, you literally, to get on 83, have to physically drive up. Like, you have to get on an on-ramp that raises you above the city, so you don't have to see what's on either side. But one of the craziest ones that I've seen is in Memphis, Tennessee, and they ran a freeway through the city, and they ran it right through a Black neighborhood, and they were going to run it through a white neighborhood. And the white neighborhood was so mad about it. They were also going to run it through part of a park. And they found somebody in the white neighborhood identified an endangered beetle in the park and convinced the city that they couldn't build an interstate through the, like, they'd torn down houses in the white neighborhood already, and they had to rebuild them because they found a beetle in Overton Park that they couldn't kill. But the Black neighborhood was split in two, and the northern section of it never came back. So you're absolutely right. There are 1,000 ways that that the story of city planning tells the story of white supremacy. And there really is, I think, almost no faster way to radicalize someone than to drive them around a city and show them its budget. Yeah. Barbara Francis had a question. Can someone help Barbara unmute?
I think she can now. You can unmute Barbara.
Okay, here I am. Hi, it's good to see you. The presentation was really good. I grew up in Baltimore, so I know something about this. I live in Bolton Hill. My question has to do with purchasing the home. So the interest rates are really low. So you can have a really nice house that costs $300,000, and the mortgage payment is not going to be that much. But trying to get together $60,000 for your down payment is sort of overwhelming. And for those of us who have houses, those down payments often came from parents or something along the line, or you work for a company. My question is about the Presbyterian, the Catholic Church, the Episcopal Church. I'm a one step at a time, one person at a time, raise a child and get this one through. Why don't the churches make available and give down payments for people who want to move into houses? I mean, I say, sell those Tiffany windows. You know, you could send how many kids to Gilman? You could send how many, you could do what with. So I'm deeply troubled by what I call the walk, talk the talk kind of thing. And so is there a program in the Presbyterian, the Catholic Church, which is giving, not like holding it in, more like a Habitat for Humanity kind of thing, purchase options? That's it. Thank you both very much for your presentation.
I was going to ask Michelle to talk about this because she knows more as a recent home purchaser. No, is I think my answer. Barbara, I am on team sell the building. Just generally, don't tell anybody who I'm trying to get a job with in a church that, but yeah, no, we're sitting on a lot of capital that could be used in different ways. I'm with you. But as of right now, I don't know of anything. Amazing Grace Lutheran Church just teamed up with, I can't remember the name of the organization. They bought a house that they're going to keep permanently low cost, and they're selling it to a family in the neighborhood because Hopkins is so actively gentrifying their neighborhood that they want to make sure there's low cost, safe housing still. So,
but we have funds. We have funds for Puerto Rico. We have funds for El Salvador. We have funds for COVID. And I belong to a very generous church, and somebody makes a presentation and checks come out, but it's the down payment that stops the And I can't tell you, my daughter who lives in Stoneleigh and her kids go to the Stoneleigh school, she constantly says, Mom, most grandparents are providing the education for their kids. And I say, I wish we could do that for you. But so many children that I know got their down payment from their grandparents or their parents. And I say to the churches, open it up. So that's me. That's all I have to say, McKenna. I think the same as you often.
You should definitely talk to Brown Memorial's anti-racism team.
There's some interesting discussion going on in the chat. I'm not sure if those folks want to open their mics to share. Deborah, you made a comment about what's going on in the Route 70 corridor. Would you like to unmute, Deborah?
There we go. Nope.
Yes, I hear you.
Oh, you can? Okay. Yeah. The example that McKenna gave, I just was thinking was very similar to what we call the highway to nowhere, that Route 70 that was supposed to come through the city, and the section in the Black neighborhoods was completed, but in the white neighborhood, which is, I think, mostly Hunting Ridge, maybe some other people on the other side of the park. I don't think it was about a beetle, but it was just about saving the park, is what I understood. And their voices were loud enough. And so that's why we have that little segment of highway that's there. So that's very similar to that story in Tennessee.
My grandmother lived on Arlington Avenue between Mulberry and Franklin. She was moved out of that area.
And I also thought it was an interesting question that Susan Moody asked about the placement of churches in relation to redlining. Do you have any answer to that, McKenna?
I know that there's a long history in our presbytery of churches moving to suburbs. But beyond that, what the question is, how are they placed related to redlining? Like, Susan, do you want to say more about your question? I want to make sure I'm answering what you asked.
Is Susan unmuted? Susan, you can unmute.
Yeah.
There you go.
Okay. Okay, am I unmuted?
Yes.
Hear you.
So I just know in little snippets that I've read about various congregations moving around the city, and now I'm thinking about like the block busting, and wondering if some of those movements were related to those sort of things, and how the presbytery has been complicit in all that.
Yeah.
This is Guy. We're both here listening. This is something too that, as we work towards dismantling racism in our presbytery, and it's something Susan and I have talked about a lot, it would be really interesting for every church in the presbytery to delve into their histories, to see just how historically they played a role in racism, from when they moved from the city out into the suburbs, for whatever. I mean, it would really be a great launching conversation for people, and might be, some of our white members, get all caught up in their white fragility. This might be a way to sort of objectively get people to start talking about, taking a real look at their history and have some honest conversation.
Mm-hmm.
I could share something that Andrew Foster Connors sent. He's the pastor at Brown Memorial. And he sent this. William Marbury, a leader of the segregationists, who was an architect of segregationist policies, wrote to many white churches in the 1920s to encourage them to put in their charters that they would never sell their properties to Black people. When I learned this, and this is Andrew speaking, when I learned this, I spent some time painstakingly looking for evidence. And sure enough, the trustee minutes reveal the receipt of a letter making this request. Rather than replying in principle, the trustees of Brown declined by saying, in effect, the charter wouldn't allow the church to sell its property in any case, and not specifically not to Black people. He said he did find evidence that Babcock Presbyterian, which I think is in the downtown area, or was, signed the charter, signed onto a letter of the mayor at the time, demanding that he stop the Negro invasion. So yes, if we studied our church histories, I think we might find an interesting story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because Babcock's up in Lochraven Village now.
Okay.
And I think Northminster was on North Ave at some point, and I know Faith moved out from, Audrey, you're raising your hand. Yeah. I'll let you tell your church's story. You're muted.
Okay.
Yes.
I was going to say exactly what you were saying, McKenna, that a number of churches did move out, and Northminster, well, let me back up. When I took the Dismantling Racism course, when it was first offered here in the presbytery, Jana, the pastor, talked about the history that she had learned about her church, Northminster, having moved out. And I realized at that time, sort of for the first time, that that was also true of Faith. And I think, and I grew up in Philadelphia, so I have some understanding there of some of the near suburbs. And the point I really wanted to make was that I think we white folk have heard the expression that churches move to be close to their congregations because their congregations were moving to the suburbs, which I think is a thinly veiled racist statement, maybe not so thinly veiled, that rather than staying in the community, in the city where they were and being the church to the new people that moved in, they left. And in many cases, it was because of the race of the new people moving in. So.
That feels very much like country club church.
That's an interesting phrase. Hunting Ridge has its own story. It used to be in the city on Lafayette Square. And Deborah, when was it that Hunting Ridge moved to its
1930. 1930. But they did sell their building to an African-American congregation, St. James African Methodist Episcopal. So I guess they didn't sign that letter from that guy, but they left. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hey, we are coming upon our time to close. I just want to put in a word for Monday. The way we had structured these conversations initially was to share information on the first day of the conversation, the 16th, but then provide an opportunity for us to work, talk, share in small groups, even though we've done a lot of that already this evening, about what we can do about the particular topic of that day. So hopefully some of you and some others will join us on Monday for some small groups discussions about racial inequality and wealth. And then in November, we're going to have a session on health disparities and the gap between Black and white health. And you'll be able to register for that on the Presbytery's website and to read more about it in the 1619 series. In December, so that'll be on the 16th and 19th of November. And in December, we hope to have a live Kwanzaa celebration. We want to have us all understand that Kwanzaa is about community and family, sharing values, and it's not a Black holiday. We can all join in. So we hope that in December, date to be determined, you'll be able to join us for that. And join us in this ongoing series. We hope each month to have some discussions about some important aspects of racial inequality, injustice, and equity. So thank you all very much. If there's anyone who has any final words or thoughts they'd like to share. Someone did ask if we could share the links with those of you who are on tonight. We do have a list of emails for the registrants, and we'll be happy to send out the links that McKenna shared earlier. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.